Okay, I should be recording. I should be able to see there. All right, so the second chapter, chapter 2 here, is mainly talking about what we're going to do. Like I was telling a couple of guys earlier, this is going to be heavy on history. The later sections here, some of that history stuff that you probably guys have had since probably like middle school. All right, like grade school there. All right, so we'll fill this out. All right, as we go along, and then you submit it for a grade here. All right, so the first section, and this is the main focus here, is like kind of as we're getting to, what, and the title for the first section is a little misleading. This is why Americans have governments, right? And there's different type of governments, right? Like the class that we're in right now, the main focus is on the federal government. When we talk about federal, that means national, right? So you guys got to take the Constitution test, right, to pass the class. That's related to federal, but within that, you have the concept of state governments, which we'll talk about with specifically Illinois, right, for the past Illinois Constitution, and then local governments, right, communities and such, right. So the last chapter, we were coming at one of the kind of definitions was on there was the definition for just simply what is government, right. Here is essentially, and this was in your last thing you know for last records. Hello? Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So we got it.
All right.
Oh, not this hour though. I'm off fourth hour.
Okay.
And that's Miss Linda hour.
Oh, she's got
You got the round it. Yeah, no worries. Alright, so here's just a simple definition of government. This was in the last chapter. Alright. Organizations, institutions, and individuals who exercise political authority over groups of people. Alright. And government is essentially one of those concepts that make up what is a civilization. Like I teach world history. We're just talking about this in world history as we're transitioning into kind of civilization. Right? Government, in a sense, is a way to kind of organize people, maintain order, right? But in kind of that's in the kind of older kind of traditional sense, right? Since our government, the American experience here, this idea is government is supposed to kind of serve the people. Right, in that sense, right? But not all governments do that, right? And even our government sometimes falls short in that aspect, right? Now, what for the first section is essentially talking about is going to basically talk about the different types of government, right? And so I'm going to kind of break them down into three classifications, three categories, right? So monarchies, right? The first one I listed, one of the oldest forms of government is that concept of essentially what we kind of a lot of times refer to as divine authority in many cases, right? And so there's different types of monarchies, right? And we're talking like usually monarchies, we're talking kings and queens, right? Right? But in other cultures, they use different terms, right? So you have two types of monarchies. One absolute, in which we'll use in the kind of Western kind of concept here, king or queen, they hold complete power, right? And then passage from to leadership is usually based on heredity. And what I mean by that is by family, right? So usually a king, right, in the older sense, we talk about kind of like in European history during the Middle Ages and such, there was an emphasis on basically kings having sons, right? Henry VIII and that big kind of like the idea there was just like you want to pass on not just your family name, but your power as well, right? And there are a few countries in the world that would have what we classify as absolute monarchies. Like, for example, Saudi Arabia would be an example of that. The royal family in Saudi Arabia, there's no kings are essentially being elected, right? And in this kind of traditional sense, the kind of divine right of kings, the idea is that power is vested from above. All right, people become kings in that sense and pass on their kind of their lineage, in the sense that some don't, usually religion is tied in there. Some divine kind of like a god, if you will, all right, passes on this to a family. All right, they have something inherently different in them that gives them that opportunity. Now, in reality, what they have and different is they're able to basically garner support, military support in many cases in that kind of traditional sense. All right, but in most cases, like with that, kind of like we still have monarchies around today. Kind of this kind of image of kind of Louis the 14th is a prime example of this kind of absolute monarch. All right, what they refer to as the Sun King in France there. All right, this whole idea that essentially the idea of the French king as being someone who is essentially kind of bestowed power from God above. All right. In reality, here, most of the monarchies that we have in the world today would be classified as constitutional monarchies. All right. In many cases, kings and queens, those who are kind of basically kind of bestowed this kind of rule, are really not heads of government but heads of state. Right? And what they're doing is essentially many times just carrying on tradition. Right? Power is really vested in lawmaking bodies, if you will. And there's a number of like countries in Europe that have constitutional monarchies. Japan is an example of a constitutional monarchy. All right. Where they have these kings or queens, or they have these or these figures, but they don't really hold true power, right? And so, like probably the most famous kind of constitutional monarchy in our kind of the modern sense that we're most familiar with is in England. So it's kind of pixelated picture there. So you have the Queen of England there, and then her husband, Prince Philip, right? The Queen doesn't really hold true like kind of power. Power is mainly vested in what they call Parliament. All right. And so in United Kingdom and Great Britain, that they have a prime minister. Right. And we'll talk about later, we get a lot of our concepts of kind of governing, like the concept of kind of a bicameral legislature, two-house legislature, from the English. All right, because we were, and again, monarchies and kind of in our sense in the American history, and we'll talk about this, we were a country that essentially kind of did not want monarchies, right? We basically kind of like had a revolution to get rid of a king, all right? But even then, that king would be classified, while he had a little bit more power than the Queen of England does have today, you could classify that still as a constitutional monarchy to a certain extent. So a lot of countries in Europe have this, Japan, like for example, in Canada, which is a Commonwealth country, it's an independent country, but it has close ties to Great Britain. The head of state is actually the Queen of England. And when the Queen of England isn't in Canada, which the Queen of England isn't in there very often, there's something called the Governor General that kind of serves in that capacity here. All right. So we do have some absolute monarchies, Brunei, Saudi Arabia, places like that. But the most countries today have what we call constitutional monarchies. All right. And then another form of government that kind of has listed in the kind of the chapter here is the concept we call totalitarianism. Right? When you see the word totalitarianism, you're generally talking about governments that don't have a lot of freedoms for their people. All right, we're basically they're kind of heavy-handed in their way how they treat their citizens. All right. It probably one of the most probably more common form of totalitarian style of government is where we have a dictatorship, where power is vested usually in one person, a dictator, all right, or a small group. Okay, but usually what you'll have amongst that small group is somebody who kind of serves as that kind of mascot, if you will, for that kind of like type of government. All right. I don't know, in the news, there's a country in Eastern Europe here called Belarus. Belarus is going through kind of their people protesting out in the streets because they just had an election. And a lot of times in totalitarian governments, you have elections. But those elections really are just, a lot of times there's corruption in that. In Belarus, the current president of Belarus is often referred to the last dictator of Europe, right? They just had an election, but there was a lot of voter kind of oppression. You have the people that are the opposition party actually in exile. So the people are basically going out in the streets and kind of exercising something that we have kind of written in our Constitution, which a lot of countries don't have that, right? So dictatorships come in different forms, right? Sorry about that. You have like dictatorships on the concept of the right to a certain extent. And we'll talk about kind of like political ideology being right and left. And I'll explain a little bit more, like, maybe conservative and liberal in that. One type of kind of dictatorship in which we see basically kind of a small group ruling would be a concept of what we call oligarchy. Now, this concept kind of arises out of ancient Greece, and it's a Greek term meaning ruled by a few. Probably the most famous oligarchy in kind of world history in kind of ancient Greek would be Sparta. Sparta is an example of an oligarchy. You had basically kind of a small group kind of like usually kind of older men that were kind of like determining everything from like, basically it was cradle to grave kind of, in Spartan history. They would actually take young children and they would examine them. And if they had some type of like kind of physical abnormalities to them, they would essentially leave them to the elements. They couldn't have any weaklings. All right. So what essentially the kind of like this concept here has kind of been kind of played out throughout the years. The most famous oligarchy probably today would be an example would be Russia. All right. Russia has an appearance in many cases of kind of a democracy. But in reality, like Vladimir Putin, who just won an election just like last year, their courts there ruled that he can I guess remain on as president for another like 10 years or some sort, So it's essentially has this kind of facade, if you will, all right. But it's essentially the kind of the party of Vladimir Putin is essentially ruling Russia, and with that, a number of people become very wealthy. Right, those within the oligarchy, those who are closest to power, also kind of like basically kind of control natural resources. They control kind of like the elements of banking and stuff like that. So there's a vested interest in for some people to maintain that kind of structure, right? Because they become very wealthy. All right, a totalitarian style on the right that's kind of like in the kind of middle part of the 20th century was created is this concept of fascism. All right. And fascism puts a big emphasis on kind of nationalism. There's an emphasis on race. Okay, there's an emphasis on us versus them mentality. Right. There's a heavy kind of military kind of image that's associated with fascism. All right. The name itself comes from ancient Rome. All right. This was kind of created by a guy named Benito Mussolini, who was the first fascist dictator in Italy. All right, taking the word from the fasces, which was a symbol of the Roman Republic, which was a symbol of the Roman Senate there. So he takes a concept that could be related a little bit to maybe to democracy and kind of reshapes it. All right. There's Mussolini here on the left. All right, and then obviously probably the most famous fascist dictator, and an extension of fascism, Nazism, obviously would be Adolf Hitler. All right. So, but you had other countries like Spain. Was a fascist dictatorship up until the 1970s. There was a guy named Francisco Franco that ruled there. All right. And again, this term we're kind of today a very divided country politically, right? And there's a lot of people who are critical of the current administration who will throw around the term fascism, right? So this is a kind of a term that nobody wants to be classified fascist usually, right? It's a term that can be pretty divisive as a kind of a definition in kind of political sense. And then a form of totalitarianism historically on the left is the concept of communism. All right, communism and fascism historically were basically kind of two sides of the same coin. All right, but in many cases you would have like communists and fascists in Europe during the Great Depression when we started to see the kind of breakdown of kind of democratic institutions. Would fight in the streets, almost like gangs to a certain extent. All right. So famously during the Cold War, during the 20th century, we had the Soviet Union, Russia, which was the first communist state. But as far as the defined communism, the concept was created by a guy named Karl Marx. Marx is kind of creating this concept in the 1800s as a reaction to capitalism. All right, and in many cases, this hyper-capitalism where we see kind of like wealth and power vested in a very small group of people, and the number of workers, all right, what Marx referred to as the proletariat, not basically kind of working in good conditions, essentially kind of not getting their piece of the pie. All right, so it's an attempt to try to even the scale, so to speak. All right, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of communist governments that were in Eastern Europe and other places. Probably the most famous communist government right now would be China. All right. However, as Marx defined communism, China wouldn't be his defined. It's basically, in that sense, we have one political party in China, the People's Republic of China, and that's the Communist Party. But there's some elements of kind of like hyper-capitalism in there as well. Cuba is an example of a communist country. All right. Vietnam is still technically communist, all right? But as that kind of true definition, as Karl Marx kind of identified it, not so much, all right? There's a little bit of more kind of like capitalist market ideas that are kind of thrown in there, all right? So communism is definitely tied in with economics as well. And then another kind of form of totalitarian style government would be a theocracy. A theocracy is simply a government in which religion is the kind of dominant factor there. All right. In many cases in the Middle Ages, you had a number of kind of monarchies that were kind of tied in as theocracies. Basically, power and religion kind of went hand in hand. Religion became the justification for the absolute rule of kings to a certain extent. Like you can argue the Vatican City with the Pope would technically be a theocracy. All right. But it's a very small community. You have a number of Islamic states like Afghanistan, Iran, which we classify as theocracy. All right, they're often referred to as the Islamic states of, the Islamic Republic of Iran. All right, so that's and in many cases, it's one religion that comes to dominate, and there's not a whole lot of basically in our First Amendment, right? We have the concept of freedom of speech and our freedom of religion. And in theocracies, you tend to not have that. All right, so totalitarian style governments tend to kind of become what we call heavy-handed in the way they treat their citizens. Right. And so this is a kind of an image here that's kind of tied in with the Soviet Union, where you talk about a lot about what they call this kind of communist aesthetic. All right, so here's Karl Marx. He was considered the founder of communism. Frederick Engels, who's basically his writing partner, they wrote kind of together. And then Vladimir Lenin, who was the first premier of the Soviet Union, and then Joseph Stalin, who took communism from a kind of a left-wing ideology based on the idea of basically kind of giving the poor a kind of fair shake into a basically heavy-handed kind of a pariah state, or kind of a cult of personality. North Korea, North Korea is a prime example of that would be a kind of Stalinist type of communist state, where you have basically a leader kind of treated almost as a godlike figure. All right, and individual rights are pretty much non-existent there. All right, theocracy, kind of image here from the Iranian Revolution, 1979. All right, again, you see in many cases kind of a mob mentality that's kind of associated with that. So a lot of theocracies don't really kind of offer a lot of individual freedoms, if you will. All right, then the kind of third type of government here is the one that we're most familiar with, and that would be a democracy. All right, and so democracy, much like oligarchy, created in ancient Greece. All right, essentially what we have here are kind of two different styles of democracy. Like in ancient Greece, where Athens, which is often referred to as the birthplace of democracy, you would have something called a direct democracy. This usually occurs in relatively smaller communities. All right, the idea that people meet in one place, they kind of vote, their decisions directly affect them. So like an example of direct democracy is if we basically said, hey, do you guys want to take notes or you want to sleep? And then we would vote, and it would be basically all of you guys wanting to sleep would be wanting to take notes. However, I lost, all right? And so it would basically majority rules, and we would all fall asleep, all right? So that's kind of an example of a direct democracy. However, in many cases, all right, countries and states are generally too big for this to kind of be implemented. All right, so what we end up having is a little bit of a kind of different form of democracy we refer to as representative democracy. Right, a representative democracy, you elect people to do the job of government for you. All right, and so the other term for that would be essentially a republic. All right. So this concept is more the Roman kind of concept, all right? And this is one that we implement in the United States. And almost every democracy, and a lot of those constitutional monarchies we talk about are democracies, all right? They often refer to them as parliamentary democracies in many cases because the lawmaking body in which they make the laws are often referred to as parliaments, all right? And so in a republic, we basically, somebody says, hey, I can do the job of governing, vote for me. All right, we have elections. 2020 is an election year. We vote for that person, whether it's president, senator, representative, but all the way down to mayors and aldermen and school board members and such. That's all part of a representative democracy. Now, what happens if that person doesn't do a good enough job? There's various means to kind of replace that person, but the most common one is voting, right? And so voting plays a big role in representative democracies. Right. The idea if that person doesn't do the job, what you view as correctly, you could vote for somebody else. You don't have to vote for them. All right, and so this is the one that we focus on the most because this is what essentially the United States government is based on. Right? And we take it for granted, but at this time, when we'll talk about in history here, we'll talk about the next sections in history, there wasn't a lot of countries that were doing this at this time, right? So you had, in history, you had elements of that in places like with the Roman Empire, but you could argue as time goes on, Rome turns into an oligarchy, all right? There's some people that even argue, like today, our style of government has kind of shifted into an oligarchy to a certain extent, all right? Based on the fact that we have people like, who can lobby Congress and that can basically money can influence, politicians and kind of representatives and how they kind of vote and how they kind of govern, all right? That's all debatable, okay? But in the kind of true sense, this is what we have as far as a form of government. And this is what we kind of like, for the most part, 20th century, we're trying to kind of convince other countries that this is a model that should be replicated or emulated at least. All right. Tomorrow I'm gonna send you guys out a worksheet that's just basically going to cover these type of governments, and you're just going to kind of fill in like who governs in that, like what's the role of citizens and such. You can use the notes as well as the textbook, all right, from the link from the Google Classroom. All right. And then the last section here is kind of talking about what is the purpose of government, all right? And like we determined, like there's other countries that have different type of governments, all right? Like I said, this is one of the questions, all the following except kind of questions. Helping people cooperate. This is why really government in the kind of foundations of civilizations was essentially created, all right? Kind of like basically kind of providing kind of services kind of ties in with that. So government provides things like, this is a form of kind of like a government service here, all right? School, all right? And another example would be utilities, trash collection, stuff like that, all right? Now, how are those things paid for generally? How do you pay for my salary to bore you about this stuff? Or how do you pay for the trash man to come pick up your garbage? Taxes, okay? So generally, taxes are a way how you kind of provide services to a certain extent, right? And taxes are always what we call political football, all right? This is something that politicians either, talk about cutting taxes or raising taxes on certain kind of segments of the population, all right? That all kind of played into that. And so providing services is generally this kind of idea of cooperation is basically we pay taxes to pool our money, right? And then providing laws. That's a big aspect here. All right, this is basically written down. We have it written down in a constitution, a plan of government. All right, and a lot of countries have constitutions that are even oligarchies and such. But our constitution essentially is a heavy focus, the idea on citizens' rights. All right, and a lot of times the idea of limited government is kind of thrown in there. And then the fourth one, which we'll talk about when we get into things like the First Amendment, guaranteeing freedom. Our government kind of focuses on that a lot. Other governments like to talk about kind of totalitarian governments. That is not necessarily a important factor. All right, maintaining power and control tends to be that. All right, but for us, in the idea of kind of written in the Constitution of the Founding Fathers, basically, one is to protect things like your ability to speak out against the government, all right? Your ability to practice what religion you want. Even something controversial like your ability to own firearms and stuff. So freedoms play a big role in when we discuss the actual Constitution. So that's the notes for today. Is that the last thing in notes? Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Let me stop the recording here.
Okay.
Hey guys. Those of you guys at home, I'm stopping the recording right now.